go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Biomedical Library. My name is Lisa Federer. I'm a research informationist here, which is kind of like a librarian plus other stuff. So I am available to assist with really all steps of the research process, from the planning part that we're going to talk about today through the later steps of the process as well. So if you do have future questions about research, funding, conducting research, any of that stuff, you can feel free to contact me. So this is the first session of our Data Wednesdays, which is actually happening on a Tuesday because the first session was full. So I'm really excited that so many people were interested in attending. So this is going to happen the fourth Wednesday of every month at noon, and who knows, maybe the following Tuesday as well, if it turns out to be equally popular future times. So today we're going to talk about writing a successful data management plan, and I'll get into more of what exactly that means when we get started. But are there any questions that you guys have before we begin? Okay. So if you do think of anything, feel free to stop me as I go along, or if there's anything that's not clear, let me know. If you do need to use the restroom, those are outside against that back wall, and then there's also a water fountain if you go to the right. All right, so I'm going to turn these lights out so we can get started. And for those of you that just came in, make sure you do sign in before you leave, and there's also a handout at the front. All right, so today's session, we're going to cover a few different things. First of all, what is a data management plan? Why should you be, or why are you forced to be writing one in some cases? The different parts of a successful data management plan. And then we'll do a little hands-on using the DMP tool, which is a free interactive web tool for writing data management plans. And then, of course, we'll have time for your questions. So to start, a data management plan at its very basic level is a formal plan outlining how you're going to handle your data both during your project as well as beyond the life of your research project, because managing your data doesn't end once your data collection and analysis is over. This is required by many federal research funders, including the National Institutes of Health for any funding over $500,000 a year, NSF for all grants, and any humanities people here? No, all sciences people. The National Endowment for the Humanities and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, as well as other humanities funders, also are requiring this now. Even if you're not required to write a formal plan for funding purposes, it's still a good idea to at least think about these kinds of questions before you start any research project. Whether you actually officially write it all out in this kind of format, always up to you. But these are good things to be thinking about at the start of your project so you don't have surprises come up later as you go. So a couple of misconceptions that people often have about what a data management plan is. It does not require that you share all of your data with anybody who asks for it. So you, as the data collector, the funded researcher, are allowed to have certain stipulations or specifications about who can use your data, what they can do with it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But just a couple of examples of language from these different requirements from the different funders. NSF asks you to share at no more than incremental cost and within reasonable time. So you don't have to immediately send it out. You're allowed to have that period where you want to publish first, for example. NIH advises that DMPs should indicate the criteria for deciding who can receive your data and whether or not you'll place any conditions on their use. So you have a lot of leeway to say who can get it and what they can do with it. And you're also not being asked to compromise the confidentiality of your data or the privacy of your subjects. So NIH specifically asks that data be made as widely and freely available as possible while safeguarding the confidentiality of the data and the privacy of participants. And NIH asks specifically that DMPs address how you're going to handle those legal and ethical restrictions on access. So lots of options for you to say what you will and will not allow to be done with your data. All right, so now this is where we get into a little bit of the interactive portion of the class. So for those of you that are on one of our laptops, there should be a icon on the start button that says Poll Everywhere. Or you can go to this URL, pollev.com/UCLA Biomed. Or if you want to get really fancy, you can text a code from your mobile device. So I'm curious to know, have you ever written a DMP before? Whether it's been a formal one that you've been required to ask, or whether you've done one just for your own planning purposes. You guys find the icon? If you don't find it, you can just go to that address, polev.com/UCLA Biomed. Give you guys a second to all get your answers in. Oops. All right, so it looks like the vast majority of you have not written one, which is not surprising, probably why you're here. But a few of you have, which is cool. So, you know, for those of you that haven't, most of you, I think it's very likely in the coming years, even if you're not applying for NSF funding, which is the big one that requires it now, more and more funders are going to be asking for this. So it's good that you're starting to figure out now, early in the game, what kinds of things they're asking for. All right, so now, whoops, is this not going? Okay, let me change the poll. So I'm also curious to know who you are getting funding from. Since there are different requirements for different funders, you should now, if you go back to that same page, see this poll to indicate which funders you generally seek funding from. And you can select more than one option if you go to more than one funder. You just sign in there, and then there's a handout at the front. All right, so let's see who you guys are getting funding from. It's mostly NIH, not surprising where we are on campus. Anybody who answered other willing to share who else they are getting funding from? Yeah. Okay, DoD. Anyone else? All right, so mostly NIH. That makes it a lot easier for us to talk since we're all sort of on the same page. So we'll definitely address what kinds of things need to go in those plans. And I see a couple NSF funding as well. So nobody doing any weather research here, unsurprisingly. Okay, so all of that being said, keep in mind that when it does come to not just to funders, but also directorates within those funder, and also even down to the level of the individual program officer who's looking at the actual grant application, one size does not fit all. There are lots of different requirements depending on where you're asking for funding, what field you do research in, very different, sort of practices in different fields in terms of what is done with data and how it's shared. So we'll talk about sort of general things that can apply to everyone, and I'll also point you to some other places that you can get additional help for finding stuff that is more specific to an area you might work in. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those generalities that we can all sort of agree upon. So those are the sort of 5 basic components of a DMP that will go into most funder plans. So the first is data products. You need to think about what kind of data you're producing or collecting or using, whether that's in digital or physical form, and we'll talk more in depth about what questions you need to be thinking about with these. Data description and organization, what kind of metadata you're going to be collecting about your data, or otherwise how you're describing and organizing your data so it has context and it's useful to someone else besides just you or the person who collected it. Hi. Third, access and security. Who is able to use your data, and how are you protecting the confidentiality and security of your subjects? Policies for reuse and sharing. So what others can do with your data, and whether they're allowed to remix, reuse that data. And then finally, plans for archiving and preservation. What are you going to do to protect your data now that your project is done, and during the project itself? Especially for federal funders, they want to know that you're making sort of an investment in the research, that you're not just going to toss the data when it's all over. Not a great use of federal funding. So we're going to go through each of these 5 areas and talk a little bit more about the specifics within each of those. And you'll also notice that on your handout, it's broken down in the same way. So once you leave, you can kind of be going through this checklist and thinking. Okay, so the first part, what kind of data are we producing or using? So the DMP is going to describe the kind of data you're collecting, whether it's something digital, like in this case an image, or video, digital audio, something numerical or textual data like a spreadsheet or interview transcript, or even something physical like dinosaur skulls. Anyone doing research on dinosaur skulls? Oh, sad. So whatever your data is, most of what we'll talk about we'll be thinking about in sort of the digital context, but the same kinds of things apply to the physical context as well. What are you doing to actually protect any physical data that you might have, whether that is, lab samples, physical objects, any of that. So knowing what you're collecting, how much you expect to collect of it, how quickly you're going to be amassing the data, will help you plan for how much storage you need, for one thing. So something like a high-resolution uncompressed image is going to take up a lot of space, whereas something like a brief, short Word document or a spreadsheet, not that much. So you need to think in advance about how much space you're going to need, how quickly you're going to need it. This will also help you to determine what file format you're going to be using, which is definitely something you should be including in your data management plan. This is an example of all the different ways you can save a spreadsheet, and that's just one file type. So when you are starting out with your data collecting, you do have, in some cases, some options to think about in terms of how you're going to be saving your data. When you do have the choice, it's useful to think about selecting an open versus a proprietary format for your data. So proprietary formats are those that can only be used or opened by a specific type of hardware or software. So there's one specific computer program that you have to open this. The encoding may be restricted to people who purchase it, or it's not released widely as opposed to like open source software. And documents can't be opened by people who have competing software or don't have the software or hardware that specifically goes with this file type. On the other hand, open software is format that's based on an open standard. So there are standards that are like international standards that are published that everybody uses. So this might be based on one of those. Could be interoperable among multiple different platforms or programs. So if I have a Mac, you have a PC, somebody else has whatever else, we can all open it. The format may be publicly published, or it might be available royalty-free. Maybe you can even change it, modify the code to suit your purposes. And it's available to anyone to read, study, and, like I said, even modify. So when you have the choice, it's useful to go with more of an open versus a proprietary. You don't always have a choice, of course. A lot of people do research that requires that you use a specific machine and it spits out data in a particular format. You don't really have an option about that. But when you do have a choice, it's useful to think about what are some open alternatives to proprietary formats. So just a couple of examples. If you're looking at images, the BMPs, the WMFs are proprietary, JPEG, GIF, TIFF, all open, and so on. So if you're interested in finding out more about open formats that are available for your particular type of data you're collecting or your area of study, there is a website, openformats.org, that is sort of dedicated to promoting these open formats. And then I always feel weird as a librarian recommending a Wikipedia article, but the open formats article on Wikipedia is actually pretty good. And it has a very extensive list of different open formats. So again, you don't always have a choice, but when you do, try to think about those open formats. Because that means that your data will be accessible to people with whom you share your data, even if they have slightly less modern equipment than you. And it will also be available to you several years from now when the software that you use to create this data is no longer available. Anyone ever use WordPerfect? Yeah, how many of you have files that now look like that? Unfortunately, I think you can probably pay a lot of money to get that converted, but it would be nice if you had thought ahead beforehand and created that in a format that you wouldn't have to pay a lot of money to get converted years later. So thinking ahead, choosing some of these standards or formats that's going to be open, will be beneficial to, like I said, anyone you share with as well as you down the road. So any questions about the data formats part of the data you're collecting? Okay. So the second part that we're going to talk about of components of the DMP is description and organization. So this is a big topic, and we'll kind of just hit some of the high points. I will do a brief commercial for next month's Data Wednesday. It's all about data description. So if this is something you're interested in, May 22nd at noon, you can hear all about metadata. So describing and organizing your data, for one thing, makes your data better for you. It's easier for you to analyze it. I don't know if any of you have offices that look like this. This is not my office, but mine is pretty close. And you don't want your data looking like this. It's hard for you to find what you're looking for. And if somebody came to you and said, wow, I'm really interested in co-authoring an article with you, would love to use some of your data, how easy is it going to be for you to be like, okay, here, good luck, have fun with that. So if we think a little bit in advance about how we're going to describe and organize our data, we have something that's a lot easier to use. So one of the things to think about with this is naming standards. What are we going to name our different files, samples, whatever kind of data we have to make it something that we can easily understand at a glance? We don't have to go back and refer to some esoteric notes we took months ago to figure out what we've got. So for example, let's say we have this test tube that has a sample in it, and we have labeled it P4, that's our whole big project name. BHCG is this particular, say, reagent, and then E2 comes after E1, after that is E3, different samples from that series. What we get after we put it into our analysis machine, we get an image that has a file name like this, because images always have these ridiculous file names, right? That, meaningless. If we look at that, that really doesn't tell us anything about what we have in the file. We have maybe a lab notebook where we wrote down what we did with this. It's on pages 56 through 58, but I mean, how likely are you to remember that a month later? And then we have a spreadsheet that has a meaningless name, again, like Lisa's spreadsheet or, you know, data 1 or whatever. So this, all information about the same experiment, but it's really not very easy for us to use. If someone came in from the outside, they wouldn't be able to know that these all went together. So it would be useful if we had some way of connecting all of this data. Pretty simple. All we'd have to do is set up some sort of a naming standard that now everything is sort of connected. So we have the sample with one name, the image has the same name, we have a table of contents in our lab notebook so we can easily get to, you know, this is the section on our P4 experiments. And then we have a spreadsheet that has some useful name. We've also indicated that this is our raw data, which we're always going to save and keep completely separate from any analysis we do on it, any cleaning. We always want to be able to go back to that raw data. So any questions about that? Okay. So just a couple of examples of naming standards. You might have something like a site code if you're going to different locations. You indicate the date that this sample was collected. Maybe you have a lab name plus a project plus a version. Maybe you want to indicate who the investigator was. And again, I'm going to save my raw data separate from any sort of cleaned data that I create. So I have the LF01 raw data and the LF01 data that I've cleaned or formatted for SPSS. So a couple of examples. Above all, it should be something that, for one thing, you write down the code. I want to know, you know, what is the VB site code referring to? And, you know, you'll be able to figure it out later. All right, so that's describing the actual, like, files themselves. Metadata is the data we collect about data. So it contextualizes the object, the piece of data that we have, whether it's physical or digital. And the example that I like to use that most people are probably familiar with is metadata about a song. So when you open up, like, say, iTunes or whatever you use, you get that info about the song, and it has stuff like the title of the song, the artist, the album name, what number that track is on the whole disc. All of this is metadata about the file, the song itself. So we know when we go into our iTunes what we're listening to. So some fields of research and practice have defined metadata standards. If you are doing research in this area, You're probably already collecting this metadata. If you're going to submit to repositories in this area, they're going to expect you to have this metadata. So one example, this really confusing, jumbly looking thing is the minimum information about a microarray experiment. So if you do microarray experiments, you are expected, if you're going to publish, to have all of this metadata info. Some repositories, like I said, will ask for data sets to be deposited along with a specific set of metadata. So if you know that eventually you would like to put your data in one of those repositories, you want to check out, first of all, what kind of metadata they're asking for so you can collect that. So for example, this Ocean Biogeographic Information System, they take data, but they want it's Darwin Core is a metadata language, and they have modified it for what they would like to go along with their data sets. So, again, of course, you'd want to know what that is in advance so you can collect that as you go. If there is no set standard that neatly fits into the area of research that you're doing or the repository that you'd like to send it to, you can adapt or create your own metadata standard. So for example, this is the Dublin Core metadata standard, which is a fairly common, fairly basic one that can apply to lots of different areas. But maybe I want to modify this a little bit for my purposes. So instead of having a creator, I have the investigator who collected the data. Publisher, not really relevant to me, I'm just going to leave that out. When it comes to date, I have both a collection date and an analysis date, so I want both of those. Instead of an identifier, I have a patient ID, so I'm going to change that. So think about what kind of information you need to understand this data set, and what information somebody else who's never seen your data would also need to understand this data set, and then you kind of have a sense of what you need to collect. So if you do end up wanting to sort of create or adapt your own metadata standard, there are actually metadata librarians who are experts in this and can help you figure that kind of thing out. So if this is something you ever want to do, you can let me know and I'll put you in contact with the right people. So any questions, first of all, about metadata or any of that? Okay, so now your turn again to be interactive. This is sort of a bit of a thought experiment. So back at that same page, what is another word to describe the concept of cancer? It could be a word or phrase. So as we start to get these in, so as you can see, we've only had, like 5 responses, and we're seeing lots of different stuff. I think pretty much everyone that's entered something, we've had a couple repetition, but almost everybody is entering something different. I think a couple more. So we're all talking about the same thing, right? Cancer, but everybody has used a different term. How are we going to collect all of this data? If we're all cancer researchers and we're all interested in the same thing, it's going to be really hard for us to figure out that we have connected data if we're all describing it in these different ways. And the way that we get around that problem is with what is called controlled vocabularies. So controlled vocabularies are sort of like a list of preferred terms that has been defined for a particular area of study. One example, have any of you ever used MESH in PubMed? Okay, well you can come to a PubMed class and learn how to use that. But MESH is medical subject headings, and it is the controlled vocabulary that's used by the National Library of Medicine in PubMed and other NLM databases. So when we go to PubMed and we want to search for cancer, we can put that cancer word in the MESH database search to figure out what is the preferred term that goes along with that, and we would find out that it's actually neoplasms. So when we're describing our data, it's useful for us to figure out if there is a controlled vocabulary that goes along with the field that you're using, so you can be using the same terminology to describe stuff that other people in the field are using. So that means that people can more easily find your stuff when it's, say, in a repository, or they want to be able to get to your data later. Another example of sort of a type of controlled vocabulary that will help you to organize and describe things, ontologies. So standardized terms for, in this case, this is the gene ontology browser. So it describes genes by function, and it also is listed in a hierarchy, so we understand the sort of relationships between those genes. So, you know, cell wall biogenesis genes are a subtype of cell wall organization genes, which are a subtype of cellular component organization genes, and so on up the tree. So again, just sort of an added level of meaning to help describe our data. And then taxonomy is another example. So probably the best known would be the animal kingdom taxonomy. So we have, you know, the dog falls under the Canis lupus family, which falls under Canis, etc. And this is from the NCBI taxonomy browser. So again, it's worth putting a little effort in to figure out if there is some sort of you know, set of terms that can be used to describe data in your field. Will help you find data later, will help other people to find your data. Also, if you're submitting articles to publications, having controlled vocabularies to describe, like if you're asked to submit keywords, really useful as well. So any questions about any of that? Okay, like I said, that was the 5-minute preview. There's a lot to understand about metadata, so if you're interested in learning more about that, come back next month. So third component of the data management plan, access and security. So although funders do encourage you to share your data, your DMP also needs to include plans for how you're going to secure your data as well. So this includes things like keeping your data safe from loss by like backing it up. So your data management plan should indicate how you plan to back up your data, how often you plan to back it up, whether that's going to be automated. It's really easy to automatically update or back up your data, so there's really no excuse for not doing that. I had a computer crash like 2 years ago, and I went to the Mac store and I sat down at the Genius Bar and I said, like, my computer crashed, what can I do? And the guy was like, did you back up your data? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, oh, really? Like, wow. He was like so used to having that smug, you lost all your data, but no, I'm a librarian, I backed it up. So don't be one of those people who loses your data. Easy to set up backup. Especially here in Southern California, where we have things like earthquakes, it's especially important that you have redundant copies of both physical and digital data, just in case, God forbid, something happens. Especially physical stuff. You don't necessarily think about having to have multiple copies of that, but you know, what if your lab catches on fire? What if, you know, the building collapses? Where is that data going to be backed up? Ideally, it would be at some off-site location, so if something did happen to the first set, the second set is okay, sort of like how the president and vice president are never in the same place at the same time. If that's not a possibility, at least have some second copy. So you also need to think about what security precautions you're going to take to ensure that various requirements are met. Some of you might be collecting data that HIPAA would apply to. So there are sort of an extra, you know, set of requirements you have to worry about with that. Other confidentiality things might be an issue depending on what you agreed to when you did your IRB application. So just be aware of those and how you're going to meet those requirements. So because this is not my area of expertise, I do have some additional links that you can check out. So we have an Office of IT Security here at UCLA. I got the impression that they do consulting. I don't know if that's a fee-based thing, but they have on their website links to different policies that you have to follow because you're at UCLA, so good to be aware of that. The Office of Research Administration has a HIPAA page, so they have information about that and how you can comply. There's an Office of Human Research Protection program, and then an Office of Intellectual Property if you have questions about like copyright, inventions, patenting, any of that kind of stuff. So lots of additional resources there. So any questions about any of that? Okay. So then the fourth component, reuse and sharing. So really a big component of the data management plan is that funders do want you to allow other people to reuse this data. This increases their return on the investment that they made in your research. And it's also especially useful for unique data sets. Some stuff we can reproduce it later, we can go into the lab, recreate that experiment, but some stuff is truly unique data that happened one time and we'll never be able to reproduce that. So like, for example, earthquake data, it happened once, we can't redo the earthquake, so that data set is a little bit more special. So when it comes to sharing with others, you can ask for funding in your grant application. You can also ask, in some cases, for supplemental funding if your grant is already funded to offset the cost of sharing. You can also charge people who are requesting your data a fee if it is going to cost you something to share that data with them, but they do specify, all the funders, that it can be at no more than incremental cost. So you can't charge them, like thousands of dollars for your super awesome data. If it costs you something to burn it on a DVD or whatever and send it, you can charge them for that. So you're not expected to lose money on sharing. So if you are going to be sharing your data, it's useful to think about what sort of stipulations you want to put on what people can do with your data. And one way of doing that is with what's called Creative Commons licensing. How many of you have seen this Creative Commons symbol on the web? A couple of you. So Creative Commons is an organization that has come up with these different licensing sort of standards. And this is just a couple of the various licenses that are available. But basically this says that you are sharing, you are having open data, but what you would like people to be allowed to do with it. So one of the really common ones is a CC BY license that says that other people can reuse your work, they can sort of change it up if they want, they can use part or all of it, as long as they credit you as being the creator of that work. So if you put it on the internet, people can download it, whatever, reuse it, put it on their website, as long as they link back to you. So the CC BY share alike is same kind of thing, but it also specifies that if the people who use your data go on to publish it somewhere, that they also have to use the same CC BY license for whatever they put out. So you're sort of perpetuating the open data by using that. A CC BY NC says that other people can do all that stuff as long as their works are non-commercial. So it says that people can recreate stuff from your data, but they can't like sell it and make a profit. And then the CC BY ND, no derivatives, says that people can use your stuff, but it has to be in the original, unchanged, whole format that you put it out there as. So like I said, there's several more of these that may apply to your data. Their website is there if you're interested in learning more about this. But it's one way of sort of attaching some stipulations to it without really like completely closing off your data. Okay, so the final portion we want to think about is once we're all done with our data, what is going to happen to it? How are we going to preserve it in the long term? We don't want our data to end up on the side of the road all sad like this. We want to have this data accessible to not just you, but to other people in the future. So several different options for that. You could deposit your data in a repository. One example would be an institutional repository. So in the UCs, we have a service called Merit. This is they call it a cost-effective repository. I don't know about pricing, but it's, I think, supposedly cheaper than like going to other repositories. So if you had data you wanted to make available either publicly or privately, you can put it in Merit. There are also lots and lots of subject-specific repositories. So these are just a few examples, mostly the ones that had pretty logos. But if you go to databib.org, it's a searchable list of repositories. So if you're collecting data about worms and you want to know where should I put my worm data, you can find all the repositories that collect worm data. So really useful to know whether you're going to deposit stuff or whether you just want to find data. Most of these are open, freely available. You can go and see other people's data that they've uploaded. So, and most of these are, it's free for you to upload data as well. So this is a place where you can store data at no cost to you. So it may be that you are not interested in sending your data to a repository and you are just going to keep the data for yourself. If that is the case, you should consider planning for how you are going to ensure that this data remains viable and accessible in the long term. It may not, you don't want to necessarily keep it forever, but at least for a set period of time, how are we going to make sure this data remains available? So, for example, you might need to think about migrating formats. If you have any of these, chances are that you are not able to use them. So if your data is on there, it is basically useless. Again, you can probably pay a lot of money and have someone get it off for you, but it would be a lot easier if you sort of think about when you still have access to one of those readers, maybe moving it over to something that will be a more long-lasting format. So, any questions about any of that? Okay, so now I wanted to take a look at the DMP tool, which, like I said, is this free web service that allows you to put together a DMP. So the URL is dmp.cdlib.org, and I would encourage you to follow along on your laptops. So while you're getting there, I will kind of walk you through what we have on this page. So the DMP tool, like I said, is free. It's open to anybody. Because we are at UCLA, we are a partner institution, and so you can log in and save stuff using your UCLA logon, which I'll show you how to do in a second. But if you do have friends or colleagues that are at another institution that is not a partner institution, anyone can use this. So under the DMP news section, this is their blog. They are doing a lot of work on updating, revamping this. So if you're interested in keeping up with that, you can check that out. This funder requirements is really useful. So what we have here is a list of funder requirements that are supported by the DMP tool, and it has a link to the funder's advice about what goes in the data management plan. There are a couple that have sample plans, so you can take a look and see what does an actual plan submitted to that organization look like. And then the template in rich text format. This is basically just the template that you will also be using if you use the web form, but you can kind of see what those look like and what information they're asking for. And load all of this stuff on Word. So it has stuff like, if you're sending this to the NEH Office of Digital Humanities, the different areas that they're asking for, and sort of advice or guidance on what should go in those areas. So that, as you can see, there's lots of different funders available on the site. So that's all available to anybody. You don't have to log in to see any of that. Let's go ahead and log in. You'll see there's a login button at the top right-hand corner of the screen. When you click on that, you'll need to select if you're a new user or a returning user. I'm returning, but probably most of you are new. And then you'll select your institution. So again, we can use our UCLA logon for this. If you scroll down, you'll see that we had to be different from all the other UCs, so we're up here, we're UCLA. And then we'll hit go, and I'll log on. Everyone still with me so far? No? Oh, that is unfortunate. Okay, well you can watch and bookmark it in your mind and come back to it later. It's also the, on the handout, the URL is there, as well as the whole step-by-step procedure for how to log in. So sorry about that. If you have a UCLA logon, you can also use that for the Wi-Fi if you do want to get on. Okay, so when we're logged in, we can see I already have some plans that I've started before. We can get back to those and continue them if we want to go back and edit. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new plan. So I need to select, first of all, what funder I'm applying to. You'll see that the NSF are all broken down by directorate. Even though most of you are using NIH, I want to go ahead and take a look at this generic NSF one because it has the most robust information. And they are continuing to add to this as time goes on, so hopefully the NIH one will be more robust as well in the future. So let me go ahead and click go. So we're required to give our plan a name. This is only internal. This doesn't actually go on the DMP document, so you can call it whatever you want that will help you remember which project this goes with. So we'll just say this is project 1, the number that goes with it. Oops. And then, again, comments that are internal just to the system so you can figure out which plan this is. So this is the plan. So you would be new if you've never signed into this before. Yeah. The very first time you ever sign in, you'll hit new, and then you'll do returning after that. Looks like some of you are able to get on. Kind of weird. Yeah, so then you just log in using your UCLA, whatever you use to log into like your BOL stuff. Okay, everyone with me? Okay, so we'll save our information about what this is, and then this takes us into the actual portion where we're going through and writing the DMP, the data management plan. So we have 5 different sections for this particular funder. Other funders may have more or less different kinds of sections. We can navigate through as we like. Just make sure if you do type anything, you hit save before you navigate to the next section. And you'll see that there's also this help text at the top. We can make this box a little bit bigger so we can see. So some of the same kinds of questions that we've talked a little bit about, just to sort of remind you of what you should be thinking about as you write this particular section of the DMP. And then for some of them, there will be this additional help for UCLA. Another good benefit for logging in, besides being able to save your stuff, is that you get that campus-specific information. So, you know, if you have questions that would be like, how do I get a hold of a person at UCLA? That actually is not the correct email address. We'll have to update that. But, you know, how to get a hold of help here. Along the side, you'll also see, because you've logged in, information related to getting help here at UCLA. So like a link to the library's data management page. UC3 is the University of California Curation Center, so it's the larger UC data people, and so they have some links as well. And then links that are specific to the funder that you are clicked into at this point, so NSF stuff in this case. And then, you know, we can go through the various different sections, and each one, it will tell us, you know, what we need to be answering in this part of the document. So let me just put some text in here. So we have something, so I'll hit save and next. And we'll have a little checkbox when we're done with that section. And then when we are done, once we get to the last page, we're done. Of course, we can go ahead and click back in here if we want to go back and edit anything that we put. And then when you are finished, at the end you have the option of exporting it as plain text or as rich text. So we could export this and then just copy and paste this into, you know, whatever Word or whatever we're writing our proposal in. You can also get this in PDF, but to do that you have to go back to your plans list. So when I go back to that list of all the plans that I have, here again is where I would go if I want to change anything. If I decided I don't like this plan, I can delete it. And if I want the PDF, I'll hit share. And then when I do that, it creates a link to a PDF. And this is a link that you can give to anybody so they could click that and get to this PDF. And again, it'll be formatted with the text that we put in and broken down into the different sections. So I was wrong, it does actually put the name that we put in, so not internal use only. So, whoops, let me get back to where I was there. And then again, we can export this to either plain text or rich text if we want to later. So, any questions about how that works? All right, then let me get back to our PowerPoint here. So now is the portion where you get to ask any questions you have about data, anything that you want to, yeah?
You said you were showing us the NSF rather than NIH.
Oh yeah, you want to see the NIH? Yeah, I'll show you the NIH. Like I said, it's just a little bit, well, for one thing, the NIH doesn't ask for as much. So it's, you know, just by virtue of the fact that they don't have as many spaces for you to fill in, it's not quite as in-depth. So they only ask for the data sharing plan. So basically all 5 of those things that we talked about would go into that one section, and then the additional data sharing requirements section. So let's just.
So under data sharing plan, then is there text to like from?
There is, yeah.
For all the 5.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So again, same kind of stuff that we've sort of talked about. Obviously more of them because all of it has to go into this one area. So, you know, at this point, they're not really asking for anything super long. We've talked about a lot of different things, but These are expected to be, I think, like a one-pager, so not anything really crazy long. I don't think NIH has any specific guidance about how long it should be. NSF asks for the 1 to 2 pages. So, it kind of is just however much information you're able to provide or want to provide to go along with your proposal. Other questions? All right. So in that case, let me get back to the slide here. So I have a couple of additional resources that I will point you to. I think these are all on your handout. So the DMP tool link is there. We have a guide for data management in the sciences, and I'll show you both of these in a second. We also have a guide that goes along with this class series. This will include these slides that we've looked at and your handout, and then eventually video of this session, which Terry has been putting together. My email address, if you have questions about any of this, or any library questions in general. There is a sort of general data email reference address that is monitored by myself and several other data-related librarians on campus. So if you have data questions, you can address those there. And then we also have email addresses for general reference questions for the science libraries. So if you do ever have a general reference question, you can certainly feel free to address those to either the biomedical library or the science and engineering library as is appropriate for your question. So let me quickly show you this guide. So this is the first one, so we only have the one page so far, but some basic information about what we covered, slides are there, handout, and then eventually video, and more to come as this goes on. And then the data management guide is a really, really in-depth guide to data management in general. So a lot of the stuff that we talked about, if you go to data, managing data, there's a data planning checklist that covers a lot of the things that we discussed in more depth. A lot of links to other resources, in-depth information about data description and organization. So it's a really comprehensive guide to data management questions in general. So it's a good place to check out. And then finally, mark your calendars for the next couple of data sessions. Like I said, May 22nd, we'll have the describing data workshop. So we'll talk about metadata, how to apply that to your information, how to use thesauri to find controlled vocabulary that goes with your kind of data, taxonomies, all the interesting stuff that you've always wanted to know about metadata but didn't know who to ask. Yeah, you can come to that. June 26th, we'll have a session on research and collaboration tools. So we'll cover things that are free resources that will help you to better collaborate with your research team and organize your stuff better. And every month, the fourth Wednesday, we'll have a class 12 to 1. So you can keep up with our event schedule at the Eventbrite page that I think most of you must have found if you were here to have registered for this class. So the last thing, I would really appreciate your help in providing feedback. If your computer's not working, you're not going to be able to do this now, but you can always log back in and do it later. There should be a link in the email address that you use to register for this class to the survey, or you can go directly to this URL. It's just a brief evaluation of this workshop. So, like I said, this is the first one, and I really, would love your feedback to improve and build upon these as we go on, and also get some feedback about what you would like to see offered in terms of topics for future sessions. And if you'd like to give us even more feedback, there's also a longer survey. It's about a 10-minute survey on research data management, and sort of asks more general questions about what people are already doing and already know, and what they're interested in finding out about. And you'll see when you get to that there were Target gift cards for the first 24 respondents, but I am very sorry, those have all been given out. So if you answer this, it will not be for a Target gift card, it will just be out of the goodness of your heart. So like I said, if you'd like to take a few minutes to do that now, or you can log back in to SurveyMonkey, again, through your email or through the slides. So we will conclude there unless there are any other questions. All right, well, thank you all very much. And if you didn't get a handout, grab one on your way out. And if you didn't sign in, and I hope to see you guys next month.